What if the Sumerians recorded what happened before the Great Flood? In the ruins of ancient Nineveh, buried beneath 40 feet of earth and rubble, archaeologists discovered something that would challenge every assumption about how ancient peoples recorded their history. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal were texts describing a time before recorded history began, an epoch when kings ruled for thousands of years, cities flourished in locations that have never been found, and gods walked openly among humans in a world that no longer exists. These were not vague creation myths or symbolic allegories. They were lists, chronologies, genealogies, the same type of bureaucratic records the Sumerians used to track grain deliveries and property disputes. The tablets describe this lost era with the precision of eyewitness accounts, naming kings, listing reign lengths, and identifying cities in meticulous detail. Then the lists reached a specific point, and the text stated simply, "The flood swept over. After that line, everything changed. The reign lengths dropped from tens of thousands of years to hundreds." The cities mentioned became ones archaeologists could actually locate and excavate. The narrative shifted from myth to history, from impossible to verifiable. This division before the flood and after the flood appears not just in Mesopotamian texts, but in traditions across the ancient world, from Hebrew scriptures to Greek mythology to Hindu epics. But the Sumerian tablets are the oldest, the most detailed, and the most troubling, because they treat the pre-flood world not as paradise lost or golden age mythology, but as documented history that was deliberately preserved so future generations would know what had been destroyed and why it could never be allowed to return. Tonight, we examine those records, the world they describe, and the question that haunts both mainstream scholars and alternative researchers. What if the Sumerians really did record what happened before the Great Flood? This is what if the Sumerians recorded what happened before the Great Flood, the list that divides history. The Sumerian king list is unlike any other ancient document. Discovered in 1906 by Hermann Hilprecht during excavations at Nippur, the tablet presents itself not as mythology or religious literature, but as an official governmental record, a chronological list of every king who ruled Sumer, from the beginning of time to the present day of whoever last updated it. Over a dozen copies of the king list have been found in different Sumerian cities, all containing essentially the same information with only minor variations in spelling or numbers. This consistency across time and space suggests the king list was not local legend but standardized historical record, something maintained and copied by official scribes as part of their administrative duties. The king list begins with a statement that would be repeated in various forms throughout Mesopotamian literature. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eredug. This opening line establishes that rulership itself was not a human invention but a divine gift, something that came from above and was granted to specific cities at specific times. The concept of kingship descending from heaven would become central to Mesopotamian political thought. Every king claimed legitimacy through divine mandate, through being chosen by the gods to rule on their behalf. But it is what comes next that has puzzled scholars for over a century. The king list proceeds to name 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before the flood. The first king, Alulim, ruled the city of Eridu for 28,800 years. His successor, Aluljar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Onmen-Lu-Ana, ruled Bad-Tibira for 43,200 years. The pattern continues with similar, impossibly long reigns. Enmengal-Ana ruled for 28,800 years, the divine Dumuzid ruled for 36,000 years, and so on. The total duration of the antediluvian period, according to the king list, was 241,200 years. Then comes the line that divides all of Mesopotamian history into two epochs. The flood swept over. After this catastrophic event, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish. But the post-flood kings ruled for much shorter periods. The first king after the flood, Gusha, ruled for 1,200 years, still extraordinary by modern standards, but a dramatic reduction from the pre-flood figures. Subsequent kings had progressively shorter reigns, declining from hundreds of years to eventually matching normal human lifespans by the time the list reaches historically verified rulers like Gilgamesh. The structure of the king list creates an immediate problem for interpretation. If the entire document is mythological fiction, why does it transition seamlessly from impossible to possible, from unverifiable to historically confirmed? The later kings mentioned in the list, those ruling after the reign lengths have normalized, are known from other sources. Archaeological excavations have confirmed their existence, found inscriptions bearing their names, and verified events described during their reigns. This means the king list is at least partially historical. The question becomes, where does myth end and history begin? Mainstream scholars typically argue that the pre-flood section is purely mythological, that the impossibly long reigns are symbolic representations of vast antiquity, and that the named kings and cities are legendary rather than historical. The flood itself is interpreted as either a mythical dividing point between primordial time and human history, or as a cultural memory of real catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia that has been exaggerated and universalized. The transition to shorter reigns is seen as the point where legend gives way to actual historical memory. But this interpretation faces difficulties. If the pre-flood section is pure invention, why does it follow the same format as the historical section? Why list specific reign lengths rather than simply saying kings ruled in ancient times? Why name 8 specific individuals rather than using generic terms like the ancestors or the first fathers? The king list treats all its entries with the same documentary tone, making no distinction between the verifiable and the impossible. It does not mark the pre-flood section as legend or the post-flood section as history. It presents the entire chronicle as fact, as an unbroken lineage from the moment kingship descended from heaven to whatever present day the scribe was recording. The geographic specificity adds another layer of complexity. The 5 pre-flood cities named in the king list are not random mythological locations. They are Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Of these 5, Eridu has been extensively excavated and is confirmed as one of the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to approximately 5,400 BCE. Shuruppak has also been excavated and was a major city in the early dynastic period. Sippar was an important religious center dedicated to the sun god. Bad Tibera and Larak have not been conclusively identified with specific archaeological sites, but references to them appear in multiple ancient texts, suggesting they were real places whose locations have been lost. If the king list was purely mythological, one might expect it to place the pre-flood world in completely imaginary locations, in distant lands across the sea, or in heavenly realms disconnected from earthly geography. Instead, it locates the antediluvian civilization in southern Mesopotamia, in the same region where Sumerian civilization demonstrably flourished. This geographic continuity suggests the king list might be preserving genuine cultural memory, even if the details have been distorted by time and mythologization. The numbers themselves have been subjected to extensive analysis. Some researchers have suggested they might represent something other than years, perhaps months, lunar cycles, or regnal years counted differently. Others have proposed that the figures might be symbolic, based on Sumerian mathematical systems and astronomical cycles. The Sumerians used a base 6-0 numerical system, and many of the pre-flood reign lengths are multiples of 3,660 squared, suggesting mathematical rather than historical significance. Yet another interpretation takes the numbers more literally, arguing that the king list preserves memory of a time when human lifespans were genuinely longer, either due to different environmental conditions, better health and diet in a pre-industrial paradise, or more speculative biological or even supernatural factors. This view finds support in other ancient traditions. The Hebrew Bible lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, with lifespans ranging from 365 to 969 years, all living before the flood described in Genesis. After the flood, biblical lifespans decline rapidly, eventually stabilizing at the normal human range. The parallel is striking enough that some scholars have suggested a common source for both traditions, whether shared cultural memory or literary borrowing. The king list was not a one-time composition. It was copied and updated over centuries, with different versions adding or modifying entries as new kings came to power. The latest copies extend the list down to kings of the Neo-Sumerian period, around 2000 BCE, more than 1,000 years after the earliest surviving copy was written. This continuous maintenance and transmission suggests the Sumerians treated the king list as authoritative history, as a record that needed to be preserved and kept current. They did not treat it as sacred scripture that could not be altered, but as living historical document that recorded the unbroken chain of legitimate rulership from the beginning of time. The theological implications of the king list were profound for Mesopotamian political culture. Every king who ruled claimed connection to this ancient lineage, claimed to stand in the succession that began when kingship descended from heaven. The king list legitimized current rulers by showing them as inheritors of an authority that predated not just their own dynasty, but human civilization itself. To rule without connection to this list was to rule without legitimacy, to be a usurper rather than a rightful king. The document was political as much as historical, serving to validate whoever currently held power by connecting them to the cosmic order established before the flood. But political utility does not necessarily mean historical fiction. A document can serve ideological purposes while still preserving genuine historical memory. The question remains, were the pre-flood kings of the Sumerian king list real rulers whose reigns have been exaggerated over millennia of oral transmission, or were they entirely invented to provide ancient legitimacy to later dynasties? And if they were real, what kind of world did they rule, and what happened to destroy it so completely that only fragments of memory survived? The cities before the flood. The Sumerian king list names 5 cities that existed before the flood, and these cities are not treated as mythical Atlantises or imaginary paradises, but as real urban centers located in specific, identifiable regions of Mesopotamia. This geographic specificity is unusual for flood mythology, which often places the pre-flood world in vague, distant lands or heavenly realms disconnected from present geography. The Sumerian texts anchor their pre-flood civilization in the same river valleys where Sumerian culture flourished, suggesting continuity rather than complete rupture with the past. Eridu is listed first, described as the original city where kingship first descended from heaven. The phrase, "the kingship was in Eridu" in Sumerian, establishes it as the primordial capital, the first place where organized urban civilization under divine authority began. Archaeological excavations at the site of Eridu in southern Iraq have revealed one of the oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers extending back to approximately 5,400 BCE in the Ubaid period, centuries before the rise of recognizable Sumerian civilization. The site contains multiple building phases of temples dedicated to Enki, the god of water and wisdom, with each new temple built directly on top of the previous one, creating a tell an artificial mound formed by successive rebuilding over thousands of years. The earliest levels at Eridu show evidence of sophisticated architectural planning, with buildings oriented to cardinal directions and constructed with mud brick following standardized dimensions. This level of organization appearing so early in the archaeological record has puzzled researchers, as it suggests the inhabitants already understood principles of urban planning and monumental architecture. Later, Sumerian religious texts consistently identified Eridu as the first city, the place where civilization began, the site from which all other cities derived their knowledge and legitimacy. This consistent tradition, combined with archaeological evidence of very early occupation, suggests Eridu genuinely was among the oldest urban centers in the region, perhaps preserving memory of the earliest phase of settled civilization. Bad Tibira, the second city mentioned in the king list, is described as ruled by 3 pre-flood kings for a combined total of 108,000 years. The name means Fortress of the Smiths or Fortress of the Metalworkers, suggesting it was a center of metallurgical production even in antediluvian times. While Bad Tibira has not been conclusively identified with any excavated site, references to it appear in multiple Sumerian texts describing the pre-flood world. One tablet fragment describes Bad Tibira as a place where divine craftsmen worked, where secrets of metalworking were kept, and where weapons and tools were forged using knowledge given by the gods. This association with advanced metallurgy is intriguing because the development of bronze working was indeed a crucial technological advancement that marked the transition to more complex civilization. Larak, the third city, is even more mysterious. It is mentioned in the king list as ruled by one king, Ensipad Zid Ana, for 28,800 years. Almost nothing else is known about Larak from Sumerian texts. It does not appear prominently in myths, has not been identified archaeologically, and its location remains uncertain. Some researchers have speculated it might have been destroyed so completely by the flood or subsequent events that no traces remain, or that it was located in an area now beneath the Persian Gulf, which was dry land during the last ice age when sea levels were significantly lower. The Gulf has risen substantially since the end of the last glacial period, around 10,000 BCE, submerging what would have been habitable coastal plains. Sippar, the fourth city, is much better documented. Known as the cult center of the sun god Utu, later called Shamash in Akkadian, Sippar was a major religious site throughout Mesopotamian history. The city has been partially excavated and was clearly an important urban center by the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE. Interestingly, later, Babylonian texts describe Sippar as the city where the gods hid ancient tablets containing pre-flood knowledge, preserving wisdom from before the catastrophe so it would not be lost. One text describes how the god Enki, knowing the flood was coming, instructed priests to bury tablets containing all essential knowledge at Sippar, where they could be recovered after the waters receded. Whether this represents actual practice of archiving important texts in flood-resistant storage, or is purely mythological, it shows the Mesopotamians conceived of Sippar as a repository of ancient wisdom. Shuruppak, the fifth and final pre-flood city, plays a central role in Mesopotamian flood narratives. This is the city from which Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim in later versions, came, the man warned by the god Enki to build a boat and save himself from the coming deluge. Shuruppak has been extensively excavated at the modern site of Tel Farah in Iraq. The site shows evidence of major flooding during the early dynastic period, with a distinct layer of water-laid sediment separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. This flood layer has been radiocarbon dated to approximately 2900 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with evidence of catastrophic flooding found at other Mesopotamian sites, including Ur and Uruk. The archaeological evidence at Shuruppak is particularly compelling because it shows signs of a sudden, violent inundation rather than gradual abandonment. Buildings were left with contents inside, pottery and tools scattered as if people had fled quickly, and thick deposits of clay and silt covered everything. While this flooding was not literally global, it affected the Mesopotamian river valley, but not the entire world. It was catastrophic enough to destroy multiple major cities simultaneously, kill thousands of people, and leave survivors with vivid cultural memory of a world-ending disaster. These 5 cities represent the pre-flood civilization in Sumerian memory, and their geographic distribution across southern Mesopotamia suggests a developed urban culture occupying the region. The texts do not describe these cities as isolated settlements, but as connected parts of a larger civilization, with kingship passing between them, trade and communication linking them, and shared culture and religion uniting them. This picture of organized urban society existing before the flood is difficult to reconcile with standard archaeological chronologies that place the beginning of Sumerian urban civilization around 3,500 to 3000 BCE, long after the climate had stabilized following the end of the Ice Age. However, the possibility that earlier urban centers existed but have not been found or have been destroyed cannot be dismissed entirely. The Mesopotamian plain has been subject to dramatic changes in river courses, with the Tigris and Euphrates shifting their channels repeatedly over millennia. Sites located along ancient river courses that are now dry, or buried beneath meters of alluvial sediment, or submerged beneath the Persian Gulf, would be extremely difficult to locate and excavate. The absence of archaeological evidence for pre-flood cities does not necessarily prove they never existed. It might simply mean we have not found them yet, or that conditions for preservation were poor. The Sumerian texts describe these cities not as primitive villages slowly developing into urban centers, but as already sophisticated and organized, as if civilization appeared fully formed rather than developing gradually. This sudden appearance is consistent with the archaeological record of Sumerian cities in the Uruk period, which seem to emerge with advanced architecture, writing, and social organization already developed. Whether this reflects rapid indigenous development, inheritance from an earlier culture, or something else entirely remains one of the persistent mysteries of ancient Mesopotamian archaeology. The kings who ruled forever. The 8 kings listed as ruling before the flood were not ordinary rulers. Their reigns were measured not in years or decades, but in tens of thousands of years, and their names, when translated, suggest they were not entirely human, or at least were perceived as different from the kings who came after the flood. These were the antediluvian kings, rulers of a world that existed in a fundamentally different state than the world that followed. Allulim, the first king, ruled Eridu for 28,800 years. His name has been interpreted as meaning stag or deer-like, though the etymology is uncertain and may be in a language predating Sumerian. Nothing else is known about Allulim's reign. No deeds are attributed to him. No myths tell his stories. No archaeological evidence confirms his existence. He is a name on a list, the beginning of recorded history, the first human, or human-like, being granted rulership after kingship descended from heaven. Al-Aljar, the second king, also ruled Eridu for 36,000 years. Again, no narrative survives describing his accomplishments or character. The king list provides only bare facts: name, city, reign length. The absence of stories about these earliest kings is striking. If they were purely legendary figures invented to fill out an imaginary pre-flood history, one might expect elaborate myths about their deeds, their conflicts, their relationships with the gods. Instead, there is only documentation, names and numbers, recorded with bureaucratic precision. Enmenluana, the third king, is the first to rule a city other than Eridu. His name means Lord of the foundation of the nation, or Lord who makes the me of sovereignty, referencing the Mesopotamian concept of me, divine principles, or cosmic laws that governed civilization. He ruled Bad Tibira for 43,200 years. Later, traditions sometimes identified Enmenluana as a particularly wise king, a lawgiver who received knowledge directly from the gods and established justice. Some texts hint that he may have been partially divine, born of a human mother and a divine father, though these references are fragmentary and ambiguous. Enmengalana, the fourth king, also ruled Bad Tibira for 28,800 years. His name means Lord of the Great Me, or Lord of the Princely Crown, again referencing divine authority and cosmic order. He is sometimes associated with shepherding and pastoral care, suggesting his reign may have coincided with developments in animal domestication or pastoral economy. The fifth king bears one of the few names recognizable from later mythology, Dumuzid, who ruled Bad Tibira for 36,000 years. Dumuzid, called Tammuz in later Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, became one of the central figures in Mesopotamian religion, the shepherd king who became the consort of the goddess Inanna, who died and descended to the underworld, and whose annual death and resurrection symbolized the agricultural cycle. The fact that the pre-flood king list places a version of Dumuzid as ruling before the flood suggests complex layering of tradition, where a mythological figure was also understood as a historical king, or where a historical king became the basis for later myth. Onsipad-Zidana, the sixth king, ruled Larak for 28,800 years. His name means Lord of the Righteous Shepherd, or Lord of True Shepherding, continuing the pastoral associations. Some scholars have speculated these pastoral references might indicate the pre-flood period was characterized more by herding cultures than by agriculture, though the existence of cities suggests at least some agricultural base to support urban populations. Enmen-Durana, the seventh king, ruled Sippar for 21,000 years. This king is particularly significant because later Babylonian texts explicitly identify him with Enmeduranki, a legendary figure who was said to have been taken to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad, taught the secrets of divination and priesthood, and returned to earth to establish the Guild of Priests. The text known as the Dynastic Chronicle describes Enmeduranki as beloved of Anu, Enlil, and Ea, the three highest gods, and states that he ascended to heaven, where he was shown the tablets of the gods and learned mysteries forbidden to ordinary humans. After receiving this knowledge, he transmitted it to his son, establishing an unbroken chain of priestly wisdom from the pre-flood world to post-flood civilization. The parallel with the biblical Enoch is striking and has been noted by scholars for decades. Like Enmeduranki, Enoch was the seventh patriarch in his genealogy. Like Enmeduranki, Enoch was taken to heaven without dying, shown divine secrets, and given knowledge of astronomy and the calendar. The Book of Enoch, discovered in Ethiopia and later confirmed by fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes Enoch's celestial journeys in elaborate detail, including visions of the heavenly throne, the structure of the cosmos, the places where angels are imprisoned, and the timeline of divine judgment. If Enmeduranki and Enoch are the same figure viewed through different cultural lenses, it suggests that the pre-flood traditions of Mesopotamia and the biblical tradition share common roots, possibly deriving from memories of the same historical events or individuals. The eighth and final pre-flood king is Ubara-Tutu, who ruled Shuruppak for 18,600 years. Ubara-Tutu is identified in later Babylonian texts as the father of Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who survived the flood by building a boat. The Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh both name Ubaratutu as the king ruling when the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. His son, warned by Enki, built the ark and saved a remnant of humans and animals. The association of the last pre-flood king with the flood hero creates narrative continuity. The old world ended with Ubaratutu's reign, and the new world began with his son's survival. The cumulative reign length of these 8 kings is 241,200 years, a figure that has inspired numerous attempts at interpretation. Some researchers note this is suspiciously close to 2,400 centuries or 240 millennia, suggesting it might be a symbolic representation of vast, almost incomprehensible antiquity rather than literal chronology. Others point out that dividing 241,200 by realistic human lifespans yields approximately 3,000 generations, which would push the beginning of the antediluvian period back to roughly 100,000 years ago, far before the development of agriculture or civilization by conventional archaeological dating. The Sumerian king list presents these rulers matter-of-factly, without explaining how they lived so long or why their reigns were measured in tens of thousands of years. Later traditions offered various explanations. Some suggested the pre-flood kings were partially divine, possessing longevity as a divine attribute. Others proposed that life itself was different before the flood, that humans were closer to their original perfection, that the world was younger and more vital. Still others argued that the numbers were never meant to be literal, but were mathematical expressions of sovereignty and cosmic order. What remains undeniable is that the tradition of impossibly long-lived pre-flood rulers is not unique to Sumer. The Hebrew Bible, the Egyptian king lists, the Hindu chronologies, and Greek mythological genealogies all feature similar patterns: ancient rulers with extraordinary lifespans before a great catastrophe, followed by a dramatic shortening of life, and a transition to recognizably historical periods. The universality of this pattern suggests either a common source, widespread cultural borrowing, or shared memory of actual conditions in some distant past that all these traditions are attempting to preserve in their own ways. The world before the waters. What did the Sumerian tablets say the pre-flood world was actually like? Unlike the biblical account, which provides only sparse details about the antediluvian period, the Mesopotamian texts include descriptions of life, society, and conditions before the Great Catastrophe. These descriptions appear scattered across multiple tablets, creation epics, mythological narratives, wisdom literature, and fragmentary texts whose full context has been lost. Piecing them together creates a picture of a world that was in some ways similar to the historical Sumerian civilization, but in crucial ways fundamentally different. The earliest and most detailed account comes from the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian text dating to approximately 1,600 BCE, but clearly based on much older traditions. The tablet is badly damaged, with large portions missing, but what survives describes a time when cities were not yet built and humanity lived in a more primitive state. The text then describes how the gods decided to create urban civilization, how they assigned patron deities to specific cities, and how they established the institutions of kingship, priesthood, and social order. This creation of civilization is portrayed as a deliberate act of divine engineering, not natural human development. What emerges from these texts is a picture of a highly organized society where gods and humans interacted directly and frequently. The pre-flood world was not a primordial paradise of hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature. It was an urban civilization with cities, temples, irrigation systems, and social hierarchies. The gods did not dwell in some distant heaven. They lived in temples within the cities, ate offerings brought by humans, and involve themselves in human affairs with a degree of presence that seems strange and almost mechanical compared to later religious traditions. The Atrahasis provides the most complete account of pre-flood society and what led to its destruction. According to this text, humanity was created to serve the gods, specifically to relieve the Annunaki of physical labor. The lesser gods, called the Igigi, had been digging irrigation canals and performing agricultural work for 40 years before rebelling. Rather than destroy the rebels, the god Enki proposed creating humanity to take over the labor. Humans were fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, and they were specifically designed to be workers. For a time, this system functioned. Humans labored, cities grew, and civilization flourished. The gods received their offerings and lived comfortably while humanity performed the necessary work to maintain the infrastructure of civilization. But then a problem developed. Humanity became too successful. The population grew rapidly, cities expanded, and the noise of human activity began to disturb the gods. The text is explicit about this. The complaint was not moral corruption or wickedness, but simply that there were too many humans making too much noise. The god Enlil, king of the gods and lord of the earth, became increasingly irritated by the constant din of human voices, the sounds of construction and commerce, the clamor of growing cities. He complained to the divine council, arguing that the noise was making it impossible to sleep, that the original purpose of creating humanity to serve quietly and efficiently had been perverted by overpopulation. The gods began discussing solutions, and the proposals were drastic. The Atrahasis describes a series of attempted population controls before the flood. First, Enlil sent drought to reduce food supplies and limit population growth. The drought lasted for years, causing famine, but humanity adapted, developed new irrigation techniques, and the population continued to grow. Second, Enlil sent disease and plague to thin the numbers. But Enki, who had created humanity and felt protective toward his creation, taught humans medicine and healing, allowing them to survive the plagues. Third, Enlil sent predators and wild animals to attack human settlements. Again, humans adapted, building better defenses and domesticating animals. Frustrated by the failure of these measures, Enlil finally proposed total annihilation, destroy humanity entirely through a great flood that would cover the earth and drown every living thing. The divine council, exhausted and exasperated, agreed. Enlil made the gods swear an oath not to warn any humans about the coming disaster. The decision was final and secret. But Enki, who could not break his oath to the council directly, found a loophole. He spoke not to his human servant Atrahasis, but to the walls of Atrahasis's reed house, describing in detail what was coming and what needed to be done to survive. Atrahasis, overhearing through the wall, understood. He built a boat according to Enki's specific instructions, dimensions, materials, waterproofing methods, all precisely described. He brought his family, craftsmen skilled in various trades, and representatives of all animals. He sealed the boat and waited. The flood is described with terrifying detail in the Atrahasis. The gods themselves opened the sluices of heaven and earth, releasing waters from above and below simultaneously. Rain fell for 7 days and 7 nights without stopping. The wind reached hurricane force. The waters rose above the mountains. Everything that lived on dry land died. The gods, watching from heaven, were horrified by what they had unleashed. Some wept, regretting their decision. The goddess Ninhursag, lamented that she had agreed to the destruction of the humans she had helped create. When the waters finally subsided and the boat came to rest on a mountain, Atrahasis emerged and offered sacrifice. The gods, having gone without offerings and worship for the duration of the flood, smelled the sacrifice and, gathered like flies around the offering, suddenly realizing they had nearly destroyed the very beings they depended on. Enlil was furious that anyone had survived, but the other gods overruled him. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but measures would be implemented to prevent overpopulation, shorter lifespans, increased infant mortality, and the institution of certain women who would not bear children. This narrative presents the pre-flood world not as morally corrupt, but simply as too populous and too noisy. The flood was not divine punishment for sin, but population control taken to an extreme. This morally ambiguous portrayal is unusual in flood mythology, which typically presents the catastrophe as righteous judgment against wickedness. The Mesopotamian version is more complex, more troubling, and in some ways more realistic. It depicts gods who are powerful but not omnipotent, who make decisions for selfish reasons rather than cosmic justice, and who are capable of regret and even error. The tablets also preserve fragments describing pre-flood knowledge and technology. The text, known as the Sumerian flood story, mentions that before the catastrophe, humanity possessed knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, and writing. The Descent of Inanna references wisdom tablets that existed before the flood and were kept in the temple at Eridu. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk, after organizing the post-flood world, distributed knowledge that had been preserved from before the catastrophe. These scattered references suggest the Sumerians believed their civilization was not original but inherited, that the knowledge enabling their cities, writing, and technology had been passed down from the pre-flood age. What survives in these texts is not a coherent, comprehensive description of the antediluvian world, but fragments and glimpses enough to suggest a developed urban civilization, enough to indicate complex relationships between gods and humans, enough to show that the flood was remembered as marking a profound discontinuity in human history. The world after the flood was deliberately made different, made harder, made less direct in its connection to the divine. Kings no longer lived for tens of thousands of years. Gods no longer walked openly in cities. Humanity was on its own in ways it had not been before, forced to build civilization again with only dim memories and fragmentary knowledge of what had been lost. The Divine Council's decision. The Mesopotamian texts are unusual among ancient flood narratives because they provide detailed accounts of the deliberations among the gods before the catastrophe, including dissent, debate, and even subterfuge within the Divine Council. Rather than portraying a unanimous, righteous judgment, they show a fractured, contentious decision-making process that some gods opposed and actively worked to undermine. This internal divine conflict surrounding the flood is one of the most theologically significant aspects of the Mesopotamian tradition. The Atrahasis describes the Divine Council meeting where the fate of humanity was decided. Enlil, Lord of the Air and King of the gods on earth, brought his complaint before the assembly. Humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, and was disrupting the peace of the gods. The text states explicitly that Enlil could not sleep because of the constant clamour from the earth below. This seems almost petty by modern theological standards, destroying an entire species because they are too loud, but it reflects Mesopotamian conceptions of divine motivations that were not always morally elevated. The council discussed various solutions short of total annihilation. Anu, the Sky Father and ultimate divine authority, initially suggested simply moving away, withdrawing divine presence from earth, and letting humans govern themselves. But Enlil insisted this would not solve the noise problem and that more drastic measures were necessary. Other gods suggested the gradual population reduction methods that were tried: first drought, plague, and predation. But when these failed to significantly reduce the human population long term, Enlil again pushed for total destruction. The critical moment in the narrative comes when Enlil proposes the flood and demands that all the gods swear an oath not to warn any humans. The text states, "Let all the gods by name swear an oath not to speak to any human about what is coming." This oath was binding in Mesopotamian theology. Oaths sworn by the gods were absolutely inviolable. To break such an oath would result in divine punishment and loss of authority. It was cosmic law that even the gods could not violate. Yet Enki, the god of water and wisdom, could not accept the destruction of humanity. He had played the key role in creating humans in the first place, mixing the clay and divine blood, shaping their form and giving them life. He had taught them agriculture, given them writing, and established civilization among them. They were, in a sense, his children, and he could not stand by and watch them all die. But he had sworn the oath along with the other gods not to speak to any human about the flood. Enki's solution was characteristically clever. The oath prevented him from speaking directly to a human about the flood, but it said nothing about speaking to inanimate objects. So Enki went to the reed house, where his most devoted human servant Atrahasis lived, and spoke to the wall. The text preserves his words. Reed wall, listen to my words. Dismantle your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, reject goods, and save life. The boat you will build, its dimensions shall be equal, its length and width shall be the same. Cover it with a roof like the Apsu. Atrahasis, inside the house, overheard the conversation between Enki and the wall. He understood immediately what was being communicated and what he needed to do. The text is careful to note that Enki did not violate his oath. He never spoke directly to Atrahasis, never addressed him by name, never looked him in the eye while communicating the warning. This legal fiction satisfied the letter of the oath while completely subverting its intent. The construction of the boat is described in remarkable detail in multiple versions of the flood story. The dimensions are given precisely variously described as 1 iku, about 360 square meters, in area with walls 120 cubits high, or as a cube with equal dimensions of 120 cubits in all directions. The text specifies how many decks the boat should have, typically 6 or 7, what materials should be used for waterproofing bitumen applied inside and out, and how the structure should be reinforced with wooden beams in a grid pattern. Atrahasis' neighbors asked what he was building and why. His response, as recorded in the text, is ambiguous and possibly dishonest. I am building a boat because Enlil hates me and I can no longer live in this city. I will go down to the Apsu and live with my lord Enki in the deep waters. This explanation was technically true. Enlil did hate humans and their noise, and Atrahasis would be seeking protection in waters associated with Enki. But it concealed the real reason and allowed Atrahasis to complete his boat without interference. The loading of the boat is described with similar precision. Atrahasis brought his immediate family, his wife, sons, and daughters-in-law. He brought craftsmen who possessed essential skills: a carpenter, a metalworker, a boatman, a farmer. He brought animals, both wild and domestic, selecting breeding pairs of each species. He brought provisions: grain, water, wine, oil. The text states he brought all that I owned aboard the boat, suggesting an attempt to preserve not just biological life, but material culture and accumulated wealth. The timing of the flood's arrival is described ominously. Shamash, the sun god, gave Atrahasis a sign. When the one who orders the storm sends a heavy rain at nightfall, then enter the boat and close your door. When that moment came, Atrahasis and his family boarded, the door was sealed, and Atrahasis himself personally caulked the final seams with bitumen. They waited inside in darkness as the storm began. The description of the flood itself is apocalyptic. The text states that Adad, god of storms, roared in the clouds, while Shulat and Hanish, his heralds, went in front over hills and plains. Nergal, god of plague and the underworld, tore out the mooring poles, holding back primordial waters. The Annunaki lifted up torches, whose fire lit the land, even as the waters rose. The scale is cosmic, not just rain, but the unleashing of all waters, above and below, that had been separated at creation. This was the undoing of the created order, a return to primordial chaos. The reaction of the gods watching from heaven is one of the most striking elements of the narrative. They were crouching like dogs, cowering by the outer wall, and the goddess Nintu Ninhursag cried out, "How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering a catastrophe to destroy my people? I myself gave birth to humanity. Like the spawn of fish, they fill the sea." Other gods wept alongside her, regretting the decision they had made, but powerless to reverse it now that the flood had begun. This portrayal of divine regret is remarkable and challenges simple notions of divine omniscience and unchanging will. The gods made a decision, implemented it, and then realized they had made a terrible mistake. They were powerful enough to destroy the world, but apparently not wise enough to foresee all consequences. They needed humanity more than they had realized for offerings, worship, labor, and perhaps simply for companionship or purpose. A heaven populated only by gods, watching an empty, lifeless earth, was revealed to be hollow and unsatisfying. When the waters receded after 7 days, and the boat came to rest on a mountain, Mount Nimush in the Gilgamesh version, unnamed in Atrahasis, the first thing the survivor did was offer sacrifice. He built an altar, burned offerings, and poured out libations. The gods, having received no worship during the flood, smelled the smoke and gathered like flies around the sacrifice. This undignified image gods, compared to insects swarming around food, emphasizes how dependent they had become on human worship and service. Enlil arrived and saw the boat and the survivors, and he was furious. How did any human escape? No man was to survive the destruction. But the other gods now opposed him. Enki spoke up, admitting his role in warning Atrahasis, while technically justifying his actions. "I made sure that life was preserved. You, the wisest of gods, how could you fail to deliberate and instead bring about a flood?" The council was now divided between those who supported Enlil's original decision and those who, with Enki, believed humanity should have been preserved. The resolution was a compromise, described most clearly in the Atrahasis. Humanity would be allowed to continue, but controls would be implemented to prevent overpopulation from becoming a problem again. Birth would be made more difficult, infant mortality would increase, certain women would be designated as priestesses who would not bear children, and lifespans would be dramatically shortened. The gods apparently had learned that humanity was necessary, but needed to be kept at manageable levels and at a safe distance from divine concerns. The text ends with Enlil going aboard the boat, touching Atrahasis and his wife on their foreheads, and granting them immortality as a special dispensation. They would be allowed to live at the mouth of the rivers, a distant place at the edge of the world, immortal and blessed but removed from normal human society. Their descendants would repopulate the earth, but the couple themselves would never return to the world they had known. This ending raises a fascinating question. If Atrahasis and his wife were granted immortality and sent to live at the mouth of the rivers, what became of them? The Epic of Gilgamesh provides a partial answer. In that later text, Gilgamesh seeks out Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for Atrahasis, at the ends of the earth to learn the secret of eternal life. He finds the old flood survivor living in a distant paradise, unchanged and immortal, willing to tell his story, but unable or unwilling to share his gift of eternal life with another. The flood hero became a living link to the pre-flood world, a witness to what had been destroyed, a reminder of both divine judgment and divine mercy. The Mesopotamian flood narrative, with its divine council debates and conflicting motivations, presents a theologically complex picture that challenges simplistic interpretations. The flood was not righteous judgment against sinful humanity, but a solution to a problem overpopulation and noise that some gods regretted even as they implemented it. One god actively opposed the decision and worked to subvert it while technically remaining obedient to the divine oath. The catastrophe was devastating but not total, deliberate but not unanimously supported, effective in achieving its immediate goal, but ultimately unsatisfying to those who ordered it. This ambiguity, this moral complexity, this presentation of divine beings who make mistakes and experience regret, is characteristic of Mesopotamian theology and sets it apart from the more morally straightforward flood narratives found in other traditions. The waters that covered the world. The flood itself is described in Mesopotamian texts with a level of physical detail that has led some researchers to argue the accounts preserve memory of an actual catastrophic event rather than being purely mythological constructs. The descriptions are specific about duration, sources of water, effects on the landscape, and the aftermath, providing details that seem unnecessary if the authors were simply inventing a symbolic story about divine judgment and new beginning. The Atrahasis states that the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. This is not an indefinite mythological time frame like many years or until the waters receded. It is a specific, limited period. 7 days of continuous torrential rain, combined with waters rising from underground sources, would indeed cause catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia's low-lying river valleys. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides additional details. The storm came from the south, bringing hurricane-force winds. The waters rose so high they covered the mountains. When the rain finally stopped, the flood survivor sent out birds to test whether the waters had receded enough for dry land to appear. First a dove that returned finding no perch, then a swallow that also returned, and finally a raven that did not return, indicating it had found land. This dove-swallow-raven sequence is eerily similar to the biblical account when Noah sends out a raven and then a dove 3 times. The parallel suggests either one tradition borrowed from the other, or both drew from a common earlier source. Given that the Mesopotamian texts are older than the biblical flood account by at least 1,000 years, the direction of influence seems clear. The Hebrew scribes knew and adapted the Mesopotamian tradition, modifying it to fit their monotheistic theology while preserving the basic narrative structure and many specific details. Archaeological evidence confirms that massive flooding did occur in Mesopotamia, though establishing exact dates and determining whether these floods match the mythological accounts is challenging. Excavations at multiple Sumerian sites, including Ur, Uruk, Shuruppak, and Kish, have revealed thick layers of water-deposited clay and silt that separate earlier occupation levels from later ones. These flood layers suggest sudden, catastrophic inundation rather than gradual abandonment or slow accumulation of sediment. At Ur, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated an 11-foot thick layer of clean clay in the 1,920 seconds, which he initially interpreted as evidence of the biblical flood. The layer was free of artifacts and organic material, suggesting it had been deposited rapidly by water rather than accumulated over centuries. Below this layer were remains of a sophisticated urban culture. Above it, after some gap in occupation, were artifacts from a later period showing cultural continuity, but also differences suggesting significant disruption. Similar flood deposits have been found at other sites, though they are not all from the same time period. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological contexts suggest multiple severe floods affected Mesopotamia at different times during the early dynastic period, roughly between 3000 and 2500 BCE. The most significant appears to have occurred around 2900 BCE, affecting multiple cities simultaneously and leaving deposits that would have been noticeable to later inhabitants digging foundations or wells. The question is whether any of these archaeological flood layers represents the flood described in the Sumerian texts, or whether the mythological flood is a composite memory of multiple disasters that have been compressed and universalized in cultural memory. Mainstream archaeologists tend toward the latter interpretation. The Mesopotamian flood myth, they argue, is cultural memory of recurring catastrophic flooding in a region where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers frequently overflow their banks, where spring snowmelt from mountains to the north can cause sudden floods, and where storm surges from the Persian Gulf have historically inundated coastal areas. However, some researchers have proposed more dramatic scenarios. The geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, in their controversial but extensively researched book, Noah's Flood, argued that the Black Sea experienced a catastrophic flooding event around 5600 BCE when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus and flooded a massive freshwater lake that had existed in the Black Sea basin. This flooding would have been sudden, violent, and devastating to Stone Age communities living around the lake's shores. The event would have created vivid memories passed down through oral tradition and eventually recorded in various flood myths, including those of Mesopotamia. The Black Sea hypothesis has been both supported and challenged by subsequent research. Underwater archaeology has found evidence of former shorelines now deep beneath the Black Sea's surface, and sediment cores show a dramatic transition from freshwater to saltwater conditions around the proposed date. However, whether this event could have influenced Mesopotamian flood mythology is questionable, as it occurred thousands of years before the earliest Sumerian texts and hundreds of miles from Mesopotamia proper. The cultural transmission would have had to occur through prehistoric migrations and oral tradition, maintaining accurate memories for millennia, possible but difficult to verify. Another hypothesis focuses on the Persian Gulf, which has risen dramatically since the end of the last ice age. During glacial periods, when sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today, the Gulf was largely dry land, a river valley through which the combined Tigris-Euphrates system flowed to reach the Indian Ocean hundreds of kilometers south of the current coastline. This exposed land would have been attractive for human settlement, with fresh water, fertile soil, and access to marine resources from the receding Gulf Coast. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose after about 12,000 BCE, this river valley would have been progressively inundated, eventually forming the Persian Gulf we know today. The process was generally gradual, occurring over thousands of years, but it may have included periods of rapid flooding when glacial melt accelerated or when ice dams holding back meltwater suddenly failed. Communities living in the river valley would have been forced to retreat northward as the rising waters claimed their ancestral lands. Some researchers have suggested that the 5 pre-flood cities mentioned in the Sumerian king list might have been located in this now submerged region, and that the flood represents cultural memory of the inundation of the Persian Gulf basin. This would explain why archaeological searches for some of these cities in southern Iraq have been unsuccessful. They might be beneath the waters of the Gulf, their remains covered by meters of marine sediment. It would also explain the Sumerian tradition that their civilization came from the east or southeast if the original urban centers were in the Gulf basin. Survivors fleeing the rising waters would have moved inland and northeast into southern Mesopotamia, bringing their cultural traditions and memories with them. Testing this hypothesis would require underwater archaeological surveys of the Persian Gulf, looking for evidence of human habitation in areas that are now submerged. Some preliminary work has been done using sonar to map the seafloor topography and identify former river channels and potential settlement locations, but no major discoveries of submerged pre-flood cities have yet been confirmed. The Gulf's waters are murky, depths are considerable, and political instabilities in the region have limited research opportunities. Whatever the source, whether a composite memory of regular Mesopotamian floods, the Black Sea inundation, the flooding of the Persian Gulf basin, or some other catastrophic event, the Sumerian flood tradition preserves specific details that suggest it is based on something real. The 7-day duration, the combination of rain and rising groundwater, the complete inundation of the inhabited world, the survival of a few humans and animals, and the establishment of a new world after the waters recede are all elements that appear consistently across multiple Mesopotamian texts, and that could plausibly describe a major flooding event as experienced by people living in low-lying river valleys. The texts also describe significant consequences of the flood beyond the immediate destruction. Humanity was said to have lost knowledge that had to be partially reconstructed. The direct relationship between gods and humans changed, becoming more distant and mediated through priesthood and kingship rather than personal interaction. Lifespans shortened dramatically. The world itself became harsher, more dangerous, less bountiful. These descriptions of a post-flood degradation suggest the Sumerians viewed their own civilization as a recovery from catastrophe rather than a new beginning, as an attempt to rebuild what had been lost rather than the first flowering of human culture. This perspective that civilization after the flood was diminished compared to what came before is unusual in mythology, which typically presents the present as better than the past, or at least as the culmination of progress. The Mesopotamian tradition is more pessimistic, suggesting that the best had come first, that what followed was partial recovery from near total destruction, and that certain knowledge and capabilities from the pre-flood world had been permanently lost and could never be fully recovered. This pessimism may reflect the harsh realities of life in Mesopotamia, where floods, droughts, and invasions regularly disrupted civilization and reminded people how fragile urban life could be. Or it may preserve genuine cultural memory of a time when conditions were different, when civilization was more advanced, and when a catastrophe destroyed much of what had been built. The recovery of lost knowledge. One of the most persistent themes in Mesopotamian tradition is the idea that knowledge from the pre-flood world was deliberately preserved, hidden in specific locations to survive the catastrophe, and later recovered to help rebuild civilization. This concept of antediluvian wisdom appears repeatedly in texts from different periods and in various contexts, suggesting it was a central element of Mesopotamian cultural identity, the belief that their civilization was not entirely their own creation, but was built on foundations laid before the flood. The most explicit statement of this tradition appears in the late Babylonian text known as Berossus, written by a priest of Marduk in the 3rd century BCE. Berossus was a Hellenistic scholar who wrote a history of Babylon in Greek for a Greek-speaking audience, drawing on older cuneiform sources that are now lost. His account states that before the flood, the god Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, ordered that all writings containing knowledge of beginnings, middles, and ends should be buried at Sippar, the city of the sun god. After the flood, the survivors were instructed to dig up these tablets and disseminate the knowledge contained in them throughout the land. This tradition of tablets buried at Sippar appears in multiple sources. The text known as the Era Epic mentions ancient tablets kept in the temple of Shamash at Sippar that contain knowledge from before the flood. Other references describe how certain kings, particularly in the Neo-Assyrian period, claimed to have discovered or restored ancient texts from Sippar that contained lost wisdom. Whether these claims reflect actual archaeological discoveries of ancient tablets or are literary conventions used to legitimize new knowledge by attributing it to ancient sources is debated, but the consistency of associating Sippar with pre-flood wisdom is striking. The figure of Annunaki, identified as the seventh pre-flood king, is specifically associated with the transmission of knowledge. Late Babylonian texts describe how Annunaki was taken to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad, shown the tablets of the gods, taught the secrets of divination and the proper observation of omens, learned the mysteries of oil and water divination, and was instructed in all the practices of the priesthood. When he returned to earth, he passed this knowledge to his son, establishing an unbroken chain of priestly wisdom from the pre-flood era to the present. The parallels with Enoch in the biblical tradition are so precise that most scholars accept some form of literary connection between the traditions. Enoch, also the seventh patriarch before the flood, was also taken to heaven, shown divine secrets, taught celestial mysteries, and returned to pass his knowledge to his descendants before being taken to heaven permanently without experiencing death. The Book of Enoch, which elaborates on the brief biblical mentions, describes in detail the astronomical, calendrical, and angelological knowledge Enoch received, knowledge presented as essential for understanding the divine plan and maintaining proper cosmic order. The concept of knowledge surviving the flood through deliberate preservation appears implicitly in the structure of Mesopotamian education and scribal training. The Sumerian schools, called idubas or tablet houses, operated on the principle that knowledge was ancient, preserved, and transmitted rather than newly created. Students spent years copying ancient texts, learning traditional word lists and mathematical tables, and memorizing literature that was already centuries or millennia old. The curriculum was conservative, focused on replicating the past rather than innovating. This suggests the Mesopotamians saw themselves as inheritors and preservers of knowledge rather than originators. The mythological justification for this conservative approach was explicit. The knowledge they were preserving had come from before the flood, had been given by the gods, and was therefore sacred and unchangeable. To alter the traditional texts would be to corrupt divine wisdom. New compositions were acceptable if they followed traditional forms and did not contradict established knowledge. But the core curriculum, the lists, the myths, the mathematical and astronomical tables, was treated as fixed and ancient. This raises an intriguing question. What if some of this preserved knowledge actually did derive from pre-flood sources? Not from tablets literally buried at Sippar and dug up centuries later, but from oral traditions, from knowledge passed down through survivors, from cultural memory that maintained certain crucial information across the catastrophic disruption. The alternative is that the Sumerians invented the concept of antediluvian wisdom as a way to legitimize their own innovations, claiming ancient divine origin for knowledge they themselves had developed. Both possibilities have defenders among scholars. Archaeological evidence offers ambiguous support. Tablets found in early Sumerian contexts show sophisticated knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that seem to appear fully developed rather than showing gradual evolution. The base 6-0 numerical system, the detailed astronomical observations, the comprehensive pharmacopoeia all are present in the earliest texts, suggesting either rapid development or inheritance from earlier sources. The Sumerians themselves consistently attributed this knowledge to the gods who taught humanity before and after the flood, to figures like Enki, who opened the underground waters, perhaps a metaphor for accessing deep knowledge, and to the wise kings of the antediluvian period who learned directly from divine sources. One particularly interesting text is the Sumerian king list itself, which some scholars have argued serves a function similar to the preservation traditions. By recording the names and reign lengths of the pre-flood kings, the king list preserves memory of the antediluvian period, maintains continuity between the world before and after the flood, and legitimizes post-flood rulers by connecting them to an unbroken lineage extending back to the beginning of kingship itself. The document is simultaneously historical record, political legitimation, and cultural memory, a tangible link to the lost world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly the flood narrative embedded within it, can be read as another form of preserved knowledge. The story of Utnapishtim's survival and his gift of immortality, his residence at the ends of the earth, where he maintains memory of the pre-flood world, and his willingness to share his story with the hero who seeks him, all of this functions to preserve and transmit knowledge about the catastrophe and its meaning. Gilgamesh fails to achieve immortality, but he returns from his journey with knowledge, with a story to tell, with understanding of human limitations that changes how he rules his city. The epic itself becomes a form of wisdom literature, teaching through narrative what happened before and how humanity should live in the world that came after. The question of what was lost versus what was preserved is central to understanding how the Mesopotamians viewed their own civilization. If the flood destroyed a fully developed urban culture possessing advanced knowledge, then post-flood civilization was recovery and reconstruction, attempting to regain what had been lost. This would explain the Mesopotamian sense that they were living in diminished times, that the great kings of old had possessed powers and wisdom exceeding anything current rulers could claim, and that true perfection lay in the distant past rather than the future. If, on the other hand, the pre-flood period was less developed than later periods, if the antediluvian kings were legendary figures given impossible lifespans to represent vast antiquity, and if the knowledge attributed to pre-flood times was actually developed post-flood and attributed backward for legitimacy, then Mesopotamian civilization was progressive rather than reconstructive, and the flood myth served primarily as an origin story rather than as historical memory. The texts themselves remain ambiguous on this crucial question. They describe both continuity and rupture, both preservation and loss. They suggest that after the flood, humanity had to relearn many skills, rebuild cities, re-establish relationships with the gods. But they also claim that the most important knowledge survived, transmitted through survivors like Ziusudra and through deliberately preserved records. The Mesopotamians lived, it seems, in a world that was both new and old, both recovered and degraded, both blessed with inherited wisdom and cursed with diminished capacities compared to the glorious antediluvian past their texts described but could never fully resurrect. The question of literal truth, the fundamental question that divides scholars, theologians, and alternative researchers, is whether the Sumerian accounts of the pre-flood world should be understood literally or symbolically. This is not a simple binary choice. The texts could contain elements of both historical memory and mythological embellishment, factual cause overlaid with theological interpretation, or genuine records expressed in cultural languages we no longer fully understand. The answer profoundly affects how we interpret not just these texts, but the entire foundation of ancient Mesopotamian civilization and its claims about its own origins. The case for literal interpretation rests on several arguments. First, the Sumerian king list treats pre-flood and post-flood history with the same documentary style, using identical formats for both impossible and verifiable entries. It does not mark a transition from myth to history, but presents an unbroken chronology from primordial times to the present. If the historical section is factual, why assume the earlier section is not? Second, the geographic specificity of the texts anchors the pre-flood world in identifiable locations rather than mythical otherworlds. The 5 antediluvian cities are placed in southern Mesopotamia, and at least some of them correspond to real excavated sites. Third, the parallels with other ancient traditions, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Egyptian, all describing long-lived ancestors before a great flood, suggest shared memory of actual conditions rather than independent invention of similar myths. Proponents of literal interpretation, particularly among alternative researchers, argue that the enormous rain lengths might reflect different conditions in the distant past, perhaps different measuring systems, different calendar calculations, or genuinely longer lifespans due to factors we do not understand. They point to the biblical patriarchs' extraordinary ages, the extremely long reigns attributed to early Egyptian pharaohs in the Turin King list, and similar traditions in other cultures as corroborating evidence that something unusual characterized the human condition in deep antiquity. More speculatively, some argue the Sumerian texts preserve memory of contact with non-human intelligences, whether extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional beings, or advanced humans from a previous cycle of civilization. The Annunaki, described as descending from heaven and teaching humanity, could be interpreted literally as beings who came from elsewhere, established civilization, and were later overthrown or departed. The pre-flood kings' impossible lifespans could indicate hybrid human Annunaki rulers, partially divine beings whose biology functioned differently than ordinary humans. This interpretation takes the texts at face value while proposing non-conventional explanations for what they describe. The case for symbolic interpretation is favored by mainstream academic scholarship and rests on different foundations. First, enormous numbers in ancient Near Eastern texts often functioned symbolically rather than literally, representing concepts like antiquity, authority, or cosmic order through mathematical patterns rather than historical fact. The pre-flood rain lengths are multiples of significant numbers in Sumerian mathematics, particularly 3,600, which is 60 squared, suggesting deliberate construction rather than recorded fact. Second, flood myths worldwide share common narrative elements: catastrophic water, divine anger, few survivors, new beginning, suggesting they serve universal psychological and cultural functions, rather than preserving specific historical memories. The Mesopotamian flood myth, while unusually detailed, still follows this archetypal pattern. Third, archaeological evidence shows gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization from small agricultural villages to urban centers over thousands of years, with no evidence of a pre-existing sophisticated culture that was destroyed by catastrophic flooding. The Uruk period emergence of cities, writing, and complex social organization can be explained through indigenous development driven by population growth, agricultural intensification, and increasing social complexity. The flood deposits found at various sites represent local disasters that affected individual cities rather than civilization-ending catastrophes. Mainstream scholars interpret the pre-flood section of the King list as mythological charter, establishing divine origins for kingship by extending the institution back to primordial times before historical memory began. The impossibly long reigns symbolize the nearness of those early rulers to the divine realm, their quasi-divine status, and the vast temporal distance separating them from ordinary historical kings. The flood represents the transition from mythological time to historical time, from an age when gods walked the earth to the present age when divine presence is mediated and distant. The gods' decision to destroy humanity through flooding can be read as theological explanation for why the world is as it is, rather than as it might be, why humans die, why life is hard, why gods seem distant. The flood answers the question, why is existence difficult, with, because humanity was nearly destroyed and is living in a diminished, post-catastrophic world. This provides psychological comfort by externalizing suffering. The world's problems are not humanity's fault, but consequences of divine decisions made long ago. A middle position, adopted by some scholars, accepts that catastrophic flooding occurred in Mesopotamia and left vivid cultural memories, while maintaining that the specific narrative details are theological constructions built around a kernel of historical disaster. Real floods destroyed cities around 2900 BCE, killed thousands, disrupted civilization. Survivors told stories about the catastrophe, which were passed down and gradually elaborated. Over centuries, these stories were theologized, gods were inserted as causes, moral lessons were added, and the narratives were harmonized with other traditions. The Sumerian flood myth would then be a complex interweaving of historical memory, theological interpretation, literary artistry, and cultural meaning-making. This middle position allows for historical foundations while acknowledging mythological development. The pre-flood kings might represent real rulers or ruling dynasties whose reigns have been inflated. The 5 cities might be actual early settlements. The flood itself corresponds to real archaeological evidence. But the specific details, conversations between gods, exact dimensions of the ark, 7-day duration, Ziusudra's immortality are later additions that transform historical memory into sacred narrative, serving theological and cultural purposes. The impossibility of definitively resolving this question is itself significant. The Sumerian texts are ancient, translated from dead languages, embedded in cultural contexts we can only partially reconstruct, and describing events, if historical, that occurred before writing existed to record them in real time. We are left with documents that claim to preserve history but use language and concepts that seem mythological, that describe events that seem impossible but locate them in real places, and that are consistent enough across sources to suggest genuine tradition, but fantastic enough to challenge credulity. What can be said with certainty is that the Mesopotamians themselves believed their civilization had roots extending back before the flood, that knowledge from that earlier age had been preserved and transmitted, and that understanding their present required understanding the catastrophe that had shaped their past. Whether they were correct in these beliefs, whether they really were preserving ancient history or were constructing meaningful mythology, may ultimately matter less than recognizing that these texts shaped how they understood themselves, their gods, and their place in a world that seemed both familiar and haunted by memories of something lost. The mystery that endures. Over a century of archaeological excavation, textual analysis, linguistic study, and scientific investigation has deepened rather than resolved the mysteries surrounding the Sumerian accounts of the pre-flood world. Each discovery adds context, but also raises new questions. Each translation reveals nuance, but also ambiguity. The texts themselves remain simultaneously clear and opaque in what they say, opaque in what they mean. The Sumerian king list records 8 kings who ruled 5 cities for a combined 241,200 years before the flood. The Atrahasis describes a fully developed civilization that angered the gods through overpopulation and noise. The Epic of Gilgamesh places the flood survivor at the ends of the earth, living eternally with memories of the destroyed world. These texts are consistent, detailed, and presented as historical rather than mythological. Yet they describe conditions that seem impossible. events that cannot be verified, and a world that archaeology has not found. The archaeological record shows that catastrophic flooding did occur in Mesopotamia, that several major cities were simultaneously destroyed around 2900 BCE, and that distinct cultural breaks separate earlier from later phases of occupation. These floods were real, devastating, and would certainly have created powerful cultural memories. But they were regional rather than global, affected river valleys rather than mountains, and left survivors who rebuilt rather than starting from nothing. The archaeological floods do not quite match the textual descriptions, but they are close enough to suggest connection. The impossibly long reign lengths of the pre-flood kings challenge interpretation. If purely symbolic, why are they presented with the same documentary precision as verifiable historical data? If literal, how can they be explained within known biological and historical frameworks? If distorted through transmission, but based on real figures, what would the original durations have been? And why would inflation occur so systematically? The numbers are too specific to dismiss as random invention, too consistent across sources to be copying errors, yet too impossible to accept at face value. The tradition of knowledge preserved from before the flood, transmitted through survivors and recovered texts, appears repeatedly in multiple cultures. The Mesopotamians, Hebrews, Greeks, Egyptians, and Indians all describe wisdom from before a great catastrophe that was deliberately preserved and passed down. This universality suggests either widespread cultural borrowing, convergent mythological development serving similar psychological needs, or shared memory of actual knowledge transmission following real disasters. Which explanation is correct profoundly affects how we understand the development of early civilizations. The question of what the Sumerians actually recorded remains fundamentally unresolved. Did they preserve genuine cultural memory of a pre-flood civilization, distorted by millennia of oral transmission, but retaining factual cause? Did they construct elaborate mythology to explain their origins and legitimize their institutions? Did they inherit traditions from some earlier culture, now lost, that had actually experienced the catastrophes described? Or did they do all of these things simultaneously, preserving memory, constructing meaning, and inheriting traditions in ways that made the distinction between history and myth irrelevant to their purposes? Modern archaeology and scholarship lean towards skeptical interpretations, seeing the pre-flood narratives as mythology serving social and theological functions rather than as historical records. The absence of archaeological evidence for the sophisticated pre-flood cities, the incompatibility of the reign lengths with known biology, and the parallel with other cultures' flood myths all suggest literary rather than historical origins. Yet this scholarly consensus faces persistent challenges from the texts themselves, which refuse to behave like pure mythology, and from alternative researchers who argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that we may simply not have found the pre-flood cities yet, and that our assumptions about what is possible may be too limited. What remains is a body of ancient texts that demand to be taken seriously while resisting easy interpretation. The Sumerians wrote down what they believed to be true about their origins, their history, and the catastrophe that divided the world into before and after. They did so with care, preserved their writings across centuries, and transmitted their traditions with remarkable consistency. They may have been recording history, constructing mythology, or something in between, but they were certainly recording something they considered essential, something that explained who they were and where they came from, something that connected their present to a past that was either genuinely lost or imaginatively constructed, but in either case powerfully formative. The question of what the Sumerians recorded before the flood may never be definitively answered, but the fact that they felt compelled to record it, that they preserved it for thousands of years, and that we still puzzle over it today, suggests these texts touch on something fundamental about human experience: the need to remember, the fear of loss, the hope that wisdom can survive catastrophe, and the recognition that civilization is fragile, that what is built can be destroyed, and that memory may be the only thing ensuring that what was lost is not completely forgotten. Whether the pre-flood world the Sumerians described actually existed, or was a powerful fiction created to give meaning to a mysterious present, their determination to remember it or to create the memory of it continues to shape how we understand the origins of civilization itself.